Let's take a look at our preferences under customize and preferences. So the first thing we're going to want to do is go to general, and I've set my scene levels. Yours are probably going to be on 20 and I've set mine to 200. So if I hit OK, what that means is if I start manipulating objects and I hit Ctrl Z, it will go back, and on the default it will only go back 20 times, but now it will go back 200 times. So this is going to use your RAM, but it does mean, you know, if you go off on one and start creating things and you want to go back, you can press undo 200 times, which is pretty handy. So let's go back to the preferences. So make sure that's on. Another thing we want to look at is in files, just make sure auto back is on. I usually have it on 3 and interval time of 10 minutes. Yours might be default to 5. Sometimes it kind of locks up when it's saving. But what this does is if you do crash Max and say you've been building away and Max closes for whatever reason, or your computer shuts down, your 3ds Max is always backing up versions of what you're working on. So you'll always be able to go back and find the latest modified one and open that up. Next, let's take a look at the interface. So up here we've got the main menu. I don't use this very much. I pretty much just use it for saving and starting new scenes. Sometimes I use it for grouping objects, but all in all I don't really use it that much. Over here we have the command panel. This I use all the time. I use it so much I would recommend just click and pull and drag that out so that you can have more space to play with this. This really is the home of 3ds Max. This is where we're going to create objects from. We're going to modify them. You also got hierarchy, motion, display and utilities, but these first two, create and modify, are what we're going to be using most. And then here we have the viewports. So this is where we see what's going on, what we're creating, and currently we have 4 viewports. So we've got the front, top and left, and over here you'll see that we can actually change the viewport layouts, which is kind of handy. Again, I don't really use this toolbar very much. I normally have it just on 1 viewport or 4, but I'll show you how to do that later on. Next up we've got the ribbon. The ribbon is up here. Click this button just to drop it down. So this is mainly just modeling tools, so we can go into that a bit later. And down here we've got the time slider, which is for animation, and we've got the play buttons, stop, move frame by frame. So the controller's here, and we've also got how to keyframe it here. You'll see that this set of dialog boxes, they just move things around, so we don't have to use the gizmo, which I'm going to show you in a moment, but these can be quite handy. And then in the bottom right we have viewport navigation, so this is how we zoom in and out and move around. We don't need all of these menus all of the time, so what I'm going to do is just hide some of them because we're not going to be doing any animation for a little while. So you can just click and drag on these double dotted lines and pull them off, and you'll see you can just close them here. So you can just start tearing them away and closing them. And even this ribbon I don't really use, so we can click this button here, show ribbon. So we're going to close that for now. And you've probably got this view cube on, which I never use, so I'm just going to turn that off here, show view cube, hit apply and OK. So what we're doing is just minimizing the menus and any functions that we're not going to use. This will speed up Max and also unclutter it a little bit. Let's take a look at the create panel, which is here, and we can click on geometry, and in standard primitives you'll see all of these objects that we can create. So standard primitives are just the really basic ones. So we've got box and sphere. So to create an object, you click on box, click, drag, release, pull it up, and then click again. Then you'll still be in create mode. So if I click and drag again, I'll create another box. So we right click to come out of that, and you'll see that as soon as we right click, a gizmo appears, which is this X, Y, and Z. And this is how we move objects around, which we're going to go through in a little bit. And when we select other objects, you'll see that the gizmo turns up. So that's how we move objects around. And if we go over to the modify panel, we can see the parameters of this. So if we want to change the length to something specific like 600, we can type that in here. And this is how we can basically manipulate objects. You'll also notice back in the create menu, when you do create a new object, you can see it in the parameters when you're creating it. So you can do it here as soon as you create the object whilst you're still in creation mode. So we right click and then you'll see we have to go over to modify. So go through and create some of these objects just to see what you've got and what you can do with them. So just play with the parameters as well. And once you've done that, you'll see that there's a lot more primitives here. So we've got extended primitives as well. So things like oil tankers, which are quite interesting shapes. And you've got a chamfered box as well, which is basically a box but with soft edges. And this is how we get more realistic effects. I mean, this box already looks more realistic than this one. It's got a few more parameters in modify that you can play with. So this fillet is the thickness of that curve. I'm just using the middle mouse button here to zoom in and out, but I'm going to go through the viewport controls as well a little later. I just want to show you move and rotate right now. So once you've got an object selected, the easiest way to go to move, rotate or scale is to right click and you'll see move, rotate and scale here. So you can select here, that's what I generally do, but you can also use these options up here. You've got move, rotate and scale. So with the move tool, you can move up and left and right using the gizmos. You can also do this in the other viewports and you can see it updating in the perspective view. And also if you want that back on the ground, I'm just going to right click here on these transforms and that's going to move that. So we can click and drag here as well. And if I right click, rotate, you can see we can rotate the object in various ways. And Control Z is going to undo. So we can rotate this how we please. And then we also have scale here. So we can scale in whatever direction we want as well. You can see that we've got different opportunities to scale between the Z and the Y, for example. You can click and drag and scale here. And the same goes for the move tool. If you hover over, you'll see that we can lock to one axis or two. So now we can move it around in both the X and the Z. And now let's take a look at the display modes. In the viewport, if you hit F3, you'll see it changes to wireframe. Hit it again and it will go back to shaded mode. And F4 will show the wireframe. So F4 I use constantly. Normally I will stay in standard mode. And you also get various types of shading here that you can flick through. I do normally keep it on default shading, and you've also got stylized views here, which can give some interesting effects, but they're not really what we'll be needing. So earlier on I said the quickest way to navigate to move, rotate and scale was to right click. I was actually wrong. The quickest way is on your keyboard. There's keyboard shortcuts. Q will select, W will move, E will rotate and R will scale. So to maximize the viewport, you can see which viewport's selected by this yellow box. So now we're in front view. So if we use perspective and we go down here, this will maximize the viewport. You can also use Alt W as the keyboard shortcut for that. So I spend a lot of time just in one viewport. To pan the viewport, just hold down the middle mouse button and pull that around. And you can scroll in and out to zoom in and out. And if you hold Alt and the middle mouse button, you can rotate objects. And whatever's selected will be zoomed in or rotated around. So that's useful to know when navigating a space. Now we can hit Z on the keyboard to zoom all, or with an object selected, you'll hit Z and it will zoom in on that object. I'm just using the mouse to zoom out. And then we have keyboard shortcuts to move views. So I've just hit L on the keyboard to go to the left view, F to go to front, T for top, V will bring up all the viewports. So I'm just going to hit P to go back to perspective view. And I'm just going to show you how you can select an object, right click and hide selection. You can also right click and unhide all. And you can also select an object and isolate it. So that's the only object available. You can do your work on it and then click it again and you'll be able to see everything. Another thing to be aware of is the unit setup. And I usually have mine on metric and millimeters. And this will just make sure that everything we create is created to a real world scale. Now let's take a look at how we can bring an image in as a reference plane. So this is from an exterior course. And we can see down here that the size of it is 2000 by 1088. So let's type that in, 20001188. So now we have the correct dimensions. And I'm just going to drag and drop that onto our object. And now we can see that that's come in. And you can press F4 to hide the wireframe and G to hide the grid. And with move selected, I'm just going to right click on each of these dialogues, and now you can see that that's now center. So if I go to the top view, this is now in the middle of our scene. If you can't see your texture on here, you can hit M on the keyboard or click up here to open the material editor. Use the pick material from object, click here, and you want to show shaded material in Viewport. And if it's showing and it's quite blurry, you can also go to the plus sign up here, configure viewports. You can turn up this quality, and you can also change the texture maps to 2048 and hit apply, and that should make everything basic quality. So I'm just going to click and drag roughly to the plans, and let's make it 50 by 50 by 500. So we can always go to the modify panel and make changes to this. Up here we can name it, so let's name it new box, and here we can also change the color. And if you press Z, we'll zoom in on it, and you can add height segments here. So let's press F4 to see what that's doing. So this is how we create segments on an object. And then we can go to the top view and say we wanted to position this somewhere relative to the plans. We can do that like this. With the move tool selected, we can also hold shift and click and drag to duplicate an object, and we'll make that a copy. We can also rename it here. So let's make a couple of copies of this box, and I'm going to hold control and select the other two. So we now have these three objects all selected. What we can do is go to group, we can make this the box group. And what this means is when we select it, it's all part of one group, and we rotate and they all stay together. Another important thing when working with 3ds Max is saving your files. So you can go to File, Save As. You can just call this Intro Test. We'll save that. And it's important to save regularly. And now it's also a good idea to save increments. So if we hit plus instead of save, what this is going to do is save a copy. So that's our original file, and then when we hit the plus, it got 0.1, and if I did it again, it would have 0.2. Now let's take a look at creating a camera. So we'll go to the create panel, we'll go over to camera and go to the top view, and we'll choose physical. So now we click and drag, and if we go to the left view, we'll be able to see the height of our camera. So we're going to want to pull that up. So I'm just going to right click, go to move, and you'll see that our target is here. So we're going to want to pull that up as well. And if we hit C on the keyboard, and I'm just going to press F3, this is what the camera is seeing. So we can go into modify, and we can change the focal length. But normally 35 is quite normal, but down here we can dolly and zoom out the camera. And now if we press Shift F this will show us safe frames. So if we hit render now, this is what's rendered. And we can see that the top of this box is quite near the top here, but in the render it's not. And that's because it's actually rendering a different aspect ratio. So Shift F turns on safe frames, which will actually show us what we're going to render. So if we go to the render setup, we can change our output size here. So if we change this to HDTV and hit render, you'll see that's gone widescreen, and you'll see that in the viewport with safe frames on, it's actually showing us what we will be rendering rather than what's in the viewport. So we can see the difference of this viewport and this render. Okay, so let's take a look at some lighting. We're going to go to render settings and we're going to choose Arnold Renderer. I already actually use Arnold Renderer. I'd normally use Vero Corona, but if you haven't got them installed, then choose Arnold, and we're going to change to active shade mode as well. And we'll go to material editor and we'll create a physical material. Control A to select everything and apply it. If we hit render, it's all going to be shiny. So if we just turn roughness up to 1 and then hit render, you'll see that that's rendering okay. So let's go to create, go to lights, and we'll go to photometric, and we'll just choose free light, and we'll put that in, and let's just pull that up a little bit, and let's hit render and see what happens. Okay, so we can see that that's lighting the scene, but it's not actually producing any shadows. So we can go over to the modify panel and just turn shadows on, and you'll see what happens. We've now got shadows in our scene, which is great. So to change the color of our light, we can go over to Kelvin here, and if we pump this up, it's going to go bluer, and if you put it down, it's going to get more orange. So if you did want to change to a specific color, you can actually go to filter color and just change that to red, for example. So let's just change that back to white and put it back. So if you did want to turn up the intensity, you could change that here, and you can see that that's really brightening up the scene. But there is another way, and that other way is using the camera exposure settings. So if we go up here to rendering and exposure control, we can turn on physical camera exposure, and if you just turn that off, basically what we're going to do with this off, every view is going to be lit this way. If we had used physical camera controls, then we'd be lighting each render individually. So the exposure value of 6 is pretty good. You can see what happens if we pull this down and up. So this is how we can actually control our exposure. But if we leave it on 6, if I turn it off and on, you can see what's actually happening here. So 6 is fine. If you want to see different shapes of light, we can actually change that here. So if we turn that into a line, if we bring that down to the floor, you'll be able to see better what's going on. If we change the length of it, there we go. You can change that to rectangle and just change the width, and you'll just see this all updating. Disc, sphere, and cylinder as well. Okay, so let's take a look at creating a sun, and the first thing I'm going to do is just quickly run a render. You'll see that there's no lights in the scene and that the environment is black. So we can go to the environment settings, you can click here or hit 8 on the keyboard, and we'll just see that the color is black. So what we're going to do is go to create, lights, photometric, and sun positioner. We're just going to click pull, drag and drop, and then we can just position the sun how we like. So let's have it coming through that window, and then this is also the sun height. We can adjust all this in a moment, so don't worry too much about it. And if we go back to the modifier, and in the environment dialog box, you'll see that a map's automatically been added, and also exposure control has automatically been turned on. So if we just run a quick render as is, let's see what's happened. So sun and sky has been placed into our scene, which is pretty cool. Now if we want to modify the sun and sky, some pretty cool things we can do. We've got date and time, so we can actually change the time of day using here, and you'll see it updating in the viewports. And we can have the date, so we can actually program in any date we like, and we can also choose location, so we can choose anywhere in the world. We can select from the map, so let's choose London. And we can also, so this is handy, so you can actually set the exact location for an interior apartment, for example in London on a certain day at a certain time, which can be quite useful. You can also go to manual, and you could set the sun manually, and you can also just right click and you can rotate the sun position. So we want the sun coming in, and let's bring the sun down, and let's see how that's looking. So the sun's coming straight through our window, and that's already looking great. Really simple to do. So if you want to change exposure, we can do that, but I've just hit 8 on the keyboard, and we can bring this exposure down. That's great. That's starting to look pretty cool. So if you did want to learn about lighting interior and exterior scenes, then you can check out my other courses. But next, let's have a look at some materials. So let's open up the material. I'd say we can click here or hit M on the keyboard. I'm going to use, there are two, there's slate and there's also compact, but to keep things simple, let's just use compact. So to start with, let's just go to general, physical material, and let's take a look at what we have here. So if we double click, that'll make a bigger version of our material. We can also select an object and apply the material here, and we can also show shaded in viewport. So some of the key things we'll be looking at is the color. So this base color will be the color of the material, so we can make that red. And if we click here, that will turn a background on, and we can see how the reflections are working. And if we wanted to add a image file rather than a color, we can click here, go to bitmap, and we'll be able to load up a bitmap. So we could select this concrete, for example, and we'll see that this is now what's on the material. And if we apply that, you can see that that's now on our object. And then if we scroll down, there's a slot for a bump map. So if we add the same bitmap in here, we can see that now has some depth. So if we go up, we can actually change this parameter, so we can pull it up. We can see more and more depth, but 0.3 looks good to me. So in this material editor, you can click and drag to make copies, and this is where you name objects. So if you wanted to name that one concrete 2, for example, and if we just create a new physical material again, and let's apply it to the teapot, we actually have some presets up here that we can use, which is cool. So take some time to just flick through to see what we've got. So this can be the starting point of a lot of materials. So if you wanted a wood material, you could start with this and you could update to the wood you wanted here. Next, let's take a look at how to control the textures on an object. So here we have our box from our previous scene with our concrete texture on it. And if I select it and I go to the modify tab and choose UVW map from our list, we can now control how this map is displayed. So the first thing we're going to do is select box, and we can see how each one of these mapping types changes the texture, how the texture is displayed. So we can choose box, and let's just make this 1000 by 1000 by 1000. And if I hit 1 on the keyboard, or you can click here and go to Gizmo, you can see we can actually move this around. So we can line up corners. We can rotate this, and we can also scale it. You can also choose the alignment here, and that is how to quickly UV map an object.
So now you've got the basic skills to use 3ds Max, you can start looking at rendering. And during this course we've used Arnold Renderer, and that's because for me it's the best renderer that comes packaged with 3ds Max. But over the years I've used a lot of render engines, and currently my go-to render engines are Corona Renderer and V-Ray. So from here I would recommend taking my V-Ray or Corona course that will show you exactly how to render photorealistic images. They're the highest rated on the subject and have been taken by over 30,000 3D artists around the world. You can also join the community via the link in the description.
Hi guys, I quickly want to talk about focal length of camera lenses, as these can have quite a big effect on the sense of space within the image. So in this video we're going to compare some fields of views in camera. We're going to use wide angle lenses to create depth in an image, and I'm going to show you how to use the clipping plane to avoid unrealistic results. So what a camera can see is dictated by its focal length, and you can find that under the physical camera lens properties here. So currently this is an 18mm lens. So if we bring this down to 15, you can see that the angle gets wider, and in my opinion perhaps slightly less realistic. An 18mm lens looks like this: 24, 35 and 50. So as you can see with this lens, the 50mm, the narrower the lens, the image starts looking quite flat. There's less depth in the image. So, and then when you use a 15mm lens, you can see that the image is starting to have more depth. The images at the front and the back kind of seem to have more space between each other. So I guess the temptation is to have wide angle lenses in every image, and I would actually suggest that these don't look that realistic, so I'll try and avoid that, even though I know that clients will want to show as much as they can in each image, especially if they are being charged per image. But if that is the case, I would suggest perhaps using a narrower lens. And what you can do is, as you can see in this image, the camera is actually outside of the room, and that we can show the room because we've got clipping planes on. So if I just turn that off, go back to our camera view, you can see that we're actually, the camera's in the wall. So a really useful thing we can do in 3D is enable a clipping plane, and what that will do, you see this red line, that is actually clipping out these walls. So to demonstrate, I'll go back to the camera view, and this is our near clipping. If I turn this up and down, you can see that it actually clips away at the image. If I pull that away, the wall's going to be there. So what you can do is pull the camera back without having to use a really wide lens. So this is a huge benefit for working in the virtual space, because we can do something that isn't actually achievable in reality.
In this lesson I'm going to show you how to add depth of field to your renders. Depth of field is something that can be added in your camera. So here's a few examples in the real world. You can see it adds some photorealism to your images. So let's take a look at how we can do this in our scene.
So if you open up your scene, and we'll go to the top view by pressing T and Z to zoom out, press F3 to see the wireframe. And what we'll do is select our camera, we'll right click, hit move, holding shift we'll drag it in the Y axis, make it a copy, and we'll call it DOF_1 for depth of field, and hit OK. And if you press C, you'll go into that viewport. We've still got clipping on, so if we click here, select camera, goes to the modifier, and find clipping, and turn that off. Now I think it'll be cool if we zoom in on the pillows here. So using the middle mouse button we can navigate, and also using the tools down here we can zoom in and pan around. Now I think it'll be better if we do it as a square image. So if we go up to the render setup, and let's turn the padlock off, and we'll make it 1200 by 1200. And let's just line this up to get an interesting scene. We can actually turn off snaps to make it easier to navigate. Yeah, I think something along them lines looks pretty cool. So also make sure your save frames are on if you want to see what you're going to render. You can do that by pressing Shift F. Now if we go back to the top view by pressing T, Z, and we'll press F3. So we want to make sure our camera's on targeted, and we want to enable depth of field, and we'll change our camera to 35mm, and we'll also put on specify field of view, and you want to have that on around 51, and bring your aperture down to 2.5. And then using this we can zoom it in and out. Where the target is where it will be in focus, so around 82 looks good. And now if we go back to the camera view, turn off the wireframe, and we wait a minute, you'll see the effect it's having in the viewport. So our pillows are in focus. So if we go back to the render settings, and in V-Ray and output, or frame buffer, and we'll change that to a new folder. We'll call it depth of field, and we'll hit save, and then you can hit render. Now the depth of field will add some render time, but it looks great. So when that's finished rendering, you should end up with something like this. I want to talk about the difference between a target camera and a free camera. So when you create a camera, you're going to see that it has two parts. So you go over to here, create camera, physical camera, and we click and drag. You see that we've got the camera itself, and then we've got the target. And both of these act separately to one another. So I can move this one separately to this. So this is really good if we want to focus on a specific area in a project. So let's move this into our room. Okay, so the camera view. Put it up a little bit. And let's show the camera view. And top view here. So I'm just going to select the camera, and it's currently targeting the bed. So now if I move the camera, the bed is always going to stay in focus. And the same goes for the target. We can move the target, and we can kind of pan around. So this can come in handy for animations, or just finding what you want to focus on and bringing the camera around that area. And now the other option we have is to turn off targeted. So this used to be known as a free camera, and we can see what happens here when we move the camera. The whole camera moves and the field of view stays the same. So I normally use this type of camera when animating along the spline, and we can take a look at that next. So we're going to use a free camera, we're going to animate it along the spline, and then we're going to refine the movement using keyframes. So let's start by creating a line. So I'm going to go over to splines, line, and then I'm going to click and drag to make this smooth. And then I'm going to go over to camera and create a physical camera. Then up in animation, I'll go to constraints and path constraint. And with the camera selected, I'll then click the path. Now if we scrub the timeline, you can see that the camera is following the path. You're going to want to go to the modifier panel and in the camera properties turn off target it. Now you'll see that the camera view stays the same. So a really useful option under motion is follow. So we can see what that does here. And now the field of view follows the path. So this is looking good, but we're going to want to refine it some more. So we can do that with keyframes. So let's select the camera and turn auto key on. And we're going to pull the slider on a little bit along the timeline. And then what we can do is rotate the camera, and auto key will fill in the gaps in between. So we can see that we have a nice rotation on the camera. So you can go through and do that with a few of the other frames, and that's how we can create a nice walkthrough camera using a spline as the path. Let's take a look at composition. Getting an image to look great is much more than loading a model and adding a camera, so composition can help. So here's a few things I would suggest. Today we're going to go over how to collect cool images for reference, composition ideas, and useful tools to achieve good composition. So the first thing I'd suggest is starting a Pinterest board, or at least a reference folder of interesting camera angles that you come across, and these are going to be great inspiration, and you can always show them to a client if they're looking for suggestions on camera angles. So none of these are rules, but they're good to have in the back of your mind. Next up is diagonals to corners, and this is something you can see here, which is generally quite pleasing for the eye. Next up is using straight verts. So this is something that's common in architectural photography, and seeing as we are virtual architectural photographers, we're going to do the same. And you can see how it's done here, and you can also see how that actually improves the image. And finally, there's a really great script called Image Helper. I will put a link to it in the resources, and you just download it, drag and drop it into your viewport, and you'll get these options here, and you can click on these overlays to help you composite your image. So you've got the rule of thirds, the golden triangle, golden spiral. So this is really useful for getting nice looking images.